Hi, everyone, and welcome to the program. On June 4th, 1942, one of the most important naval battles of World War II began in the Pacific Theater between the United States and Japan, only 6 months after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and 1 month after the Battle of the Coral Sea. This was the infamous Battle of Midway. Earlier this month, the National Museum of the U.S. Navy in Washington, D.C., collaborated with the USS Midway Museum in San Diego, California, to record a conversation about the Battle of Midway in recognition of the Navy's 250th anniversary. It's that pre recorded conversation you will hear today. From the National Museum is former Navy officer and EA 6B pilot James Rentfrow, currently the director of the Navy Museums Division, Naval History and Heritage Command, and from the USS Midway Museum, former Navy officer and currently ship's historian Karl Zingheim. The conversation was insightful and revelatory, with a style and rhythm you would expect from two historians with a passion for military history. Because this program is pre recorded, any questions or comments for either of our speakers can be emailed to me at paul.h.perry4.civ@us.navy.mil. Now, let's get started.
Well, Carl, thanks very much for joining us here at the National Museum of the United States Navy to talk about the upcoming 83rd anniversary of the Battle of Midway, certainly one of the seminal events in our Navy's history. And so to get right into it, I think it'd be probably good to start with a little scene setter for participants in the program who maybe aren't completely familiar with kind of the setup that was facing our forces on the 3rd of June, 1942.
Well, basically, this was probably the highest and most tense point of the entire Pacific War, quite honestly, because this was one part of the conflict where things could have turned one way or the other. That's what makes Midway so fascinating, although it's oversimplified as being the turning point of the Pacific War. I hold to the fact that it was actually the Guadalcanal campaign and Papua that really turned that out. But certainly June 3rd, the eve of battle, is one where the Japanese are coming into a campaign expecting a certain outcome, even a certain process of how the battle would unfold. And of course, the U.S. forces are fully aware of what's coming and are completely keyed up to meet them as best they can. So this is the culmination then of nearly 6 months of conflict where both sides are having to learn as they go. Both sides have spent decades planning a Pacific conflict, designing their very navies to fight a prospective Pacific conflict. And here it is, and it turns out that technology has completely changed the entire nature of naval warfare overnight with the demonstration of the Pearl Harbor attack and the fact that fast and hard-hitting carrier forces are the tip of the spear, after all, in this new technology of naval warfare. And now we're about to see, on the eve of the Battle of Midway, the first drastic demonstration of these two types of mobile forces, Japanese and American, coming head-to-head in battle at the end of the Hawaiian chain.
Right. And so, you mentioned the 6 months leading up to the battle. And I find in general, when I talk to members of the public, most of them recognize something called the Dittle Raid, which took place in April of 1942, and have a general idea that these B-25 bombers took off from aircraft carriers and bombed Japan. And to a lesser extent, people have heard of the Battle of the Coral Sea in May of 1942, But oftentimes I find that they just understand these things as sort of standalone events. And I wonder if you could talk about how these two very separate but really important events, and particularly, I guess I would say the Doolittle Raid tends to be presented as, hey, look, we went and did this thing to kind of show the Japanese that we could attack them without any other strategic context. I wonder if you could talk about how those two events play into the upcoming Battle of Midway.
Well, that's what makes the first 6 months of the Pacific War so interesting, is that it's a rare laboratory where you get to observe just how organic warfare is, any conflict is. It basically takes on a life of its own. No one side can control all factors in conflict, and it plays out in completely unexpected and even tangential ways. And this is certainly evident with the way naval forces were employed in the first 6 months of the Pacific War, especially with the carrier task forces that both sides possessed. So in the context of the Doolittle Raid, it's an example where an extraordinary gesture is made by the United States that really has no strategic or tactical justification. It essentially was a publicity stunt to kick back at the Japanese at the center of their empire and give a boost to sagging Allied morale. But what a lot of people overlook, with all the drama and valor, quite honestly, of the conduct of the Doolittle Raid, is that it deprived the Pacific Fleet of the services of two fleet carriers for several weeks to conduct this dangerous stunt. And this is demonstrated by the fact that Enterprise and Hornet barely missed joining the Battle of the Coral Sea, where an additional, certainly veteran carrier group in the Enterprise and Air Group 8 that really had a lot to learn on Hornet might have made a significant material contribution to the conduct of the Coral Sea battle, which was fought by completely even forces off Australia. And Coral Sea is interesting as well, is that it's basically the culmination of the genius of Station Hypo's signals intelligence, as we would call it today, or traffic analysis, as they did, because they correctly forecast in considerable detail the MO operation, which forces were participating, how strong they were going to be, approximately when it was going to happen, and it was spot on. That sold Admiral Nimitz completely on the efficacy of the signals analysis, because when you wind up having the battle being fought around the 7th and 8th of May, that's when Hypo, with Rochefort and his team, discovered Japanese interest, renewed Japanese interest in the Hawaiian Islands, and they were able very shortly afterwards to forecast once again what the Japanese were bringing with their MI operation to Midway. And since Nimitz was completely sold on their analysis from Coral Sea, he wasted absolutely no time second guessing or hesitating in getting Midway reinforced with additional air and defensive forces, as well as making sure that all of his available carriers, including the wounded Yorktown, got back to Pearl Harbor toute suite, rather than continuing to watch the dust settle in the South Pacific.
Do you think it's fair to say that the Doolittle Raid causes Yamamoto to push his timeline forward from Midway?
Basically, he was already sold since January, because the Phase 1 operations, as they called them, were ahead of schedule and were succeeding beyond their wildest dreams. And so that was the problem that the Japanese Navy had, that we're all too familiar with later operations in America, where we have mission creep, where certain things go well. Now what do we do? And so that was a problem they ran into in January of 1942, is the what next phenomenon. And that's where the headquarters ashore wanted to continue a drive to isolate Australia, since the Army said, hell no, we're not invading the continent. And Yamamoto, on the other hand, with his prestigious commander of the combined fleet, saying we still need to settle accounts with the Pacific Fleet in Hawaiian waters. And so Yamamoto was already set to go for months by the time the Doolittle Raid happened, what occurred then was that you had a collapse of will on the part of the naval headquarters in Tokyo, and the Army decided to climb aboard. So the real shift occurred with the doubters, on the Japanese side, about going all in with this operation against Hawaii, and as it turns out, a parallel operation towards the Aleutians in June of 1942. So that's one unexpected benefit that the Doolittle Raid had, was it kind of knocked out the stops that were holding back Yamamoto and his plan to send the entire fleet over and engage in what he had hoped would be a phased engagement with the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and thereby maybe have a basis for launching a negotiated settlement with this newly started Pacific War.
And I also think it's important to note that, thanks to Coral Sea, Shokaku and Zuikaku are not going to be available for combat. I think that's really going to play as we move into our next question here, which is to go ahead, I think, and get into the battle itself now. So kind of, how does it unfold on the 3rd and 4th of June, 1942?
Well, Midway is a demonstration where the way you run your business, doctrine really can matter. And in this particular case, there was a critical difference between the remarkably similar U.S. and Japanese carrier forces. And one critical difference at this stage of the war was that in the U.S. Navy, air groups were basically passengers. They were considered a quasi-independent military unit that just happened to be using a certain aircraft carrier as its mobile base. And this worked wonderfully because Yorktown came limping back from a tough Coral Sea battle. Air Group 5 was kind of worn out. And as it turns out, Saratoga got torpedoed in January of 42, so she's off at Bremerton for extended repairs. So Air Group 3 is basically on standby in Hawaii. They already did a ride-along in the South Pacific earlier in the campaign, but essentially they're a worked-up pre-war air group that's standing by in Hawaii. So they were able to seamlessly swap out, for the most part. One squadron stayed with aboard Yorktown, made that swap. No one batted an eye while the ship is undergoing emergency repairs in Pearl Harbor. So this is something that tends to get paved over in the histories, is that we already had a doctrine where you could mix and match air groups at will, and it worked to a T in the preparations for Midway. Where it drastically was different with the Japanese Navy and really probably spelled a doom for them at that battle was that on their side, the attached air group is as integral to the ship's crew as gunners are to a battleship. And so even though Shikoku had substantive physical damage from the Coral Sea battle, Zuikaku physically was unscratched, but her air group did suffer because of the drastically better American anti-aircraft defenses, at least at that time. And so the thought was, oh, geez, this air group here isn't ready for prime time. We'll just go ahead and have Carrier Division 5 Shikoku and Zuikaku scratched from the deployment, and we'll make do with 4 carriers. Can you imagine, as the Battle of Midway plays out in retrospect, if they had a 5th fleet carrier participating? It could have been a very different kind of action. But because of the bureaucratic arrangement, their doctrinal tradition, they kept a perfectly intact aircraft carrier ashore or in port in Japan, while the other 4 fleet carriers go out to fight the Gulter Demerong action off Midway. So this is a prime example where a minor doctrinal difference in how 2 opposing forces conduct business actually made a tactical impact in the way the battle went. And as far as getting back to the centrality of the question, basically you've got 3 American air groups standing by and the rough equivalent of a 4th air group crammed onto tiny Midway, primed and ready, just waiting to make sure they found the correct Japanese forces and would be ready to attack. Now, as it turns out, the way the battle played out, there were a lot of tactical problems in getting the aircraft out there. We were able to fumble the one fundamental that's critical for battle, and that's mass. Never achieve critical mass except accidentally towards the end of the first morning. As far as the Japanese are concerned, this is just another creep up on an unsuspecting target and pouncing upon them as they had done at Rabaul and at Darwin, and a little bit less of a surprise at Ceylon, but they always prevailed. So this was a case of here we go again. We'll take the enemy by surprise, and we'll just wait around for the rest of his fleet to show up, obligingly, to give battle while the rest of our forces catch up in time to have this scheduled appointment. So this is a case of one side going in with rather smug self-assurance, quite honestly, and a second side that's keyed up and just waiting for things to break.
Awesome. So it's probably useful for folks that are listening to us to kind of talk through the Japanese force deployment, because that's important, right? The amount of forces that Yamamoto had available to him versus the size of the force that is actually engaged in the battle itself.
That's something that always comes back to haunt the Japanese side, and frankly, they dwelt on it. Midway is kind of their Pearl Harbor in terms of Monday morning quarterbacking and if onlys. And one huge criticism was that why did they have the fleet spread out in like waves? And that tactically that was an issue. Another thing though that should not be neglected, and H.B. Wilmot is a master at describing such things, is you got to look at what the fuel state was for the Imperial Navy. The reason Japan really went to war in such short order in the autumn of 1941 was that their overseas oil suppliers shut them off, and the fleet only had a few months worth of reserves. So the entire point of going to war was to keep the fuel coming to the Imperial Navy. And here they're sending practically everything that's available in one huge sweep towards Hawaii. So they're already consuming a tremendous amount of fuel. When you're at the pointy end of a campaign, you're burning up those reserves rather rapidly. I mean, for instance, look at all the guff until at least the last couple of decades that Fletcher caught for being so concerned with refueling when he was in the South Pacific, both the Coral Sea and Guadalcanal. But the point of the fact is you need those reserves on hand, because when you're moving around at high speed conducting combat, you're going through fuel like nobody's business. So I think that's part of the problem that the Japanese plan had, was that not only were they presuming that the enemy would be behaving in a way that they needed them to for their plan to play out, was the fact that honestly, they're really stretching their fuel reserves to make this last throw, get this war over with, and get on with a peace settlement. And that basically meant that a lot of units are going to have to plod along at a more economical speed to catch up with battle in a timely manner, while Kido Butai, the carrier task forces, are doing all that extra work at the beginning of the campaign. So the logistic realities really do need to be factored in. As dull as logistics can be, it really is a defining characteristic. But unfortunately for the Japanese plan, they were presuming too much, that they had too much control over the battle space. And as far as the U.S. deployments are concerned, they show up at just the right time in just the right place. So now it came down to tactical execution. Another problem the Americans suffer, and that this hasn't been dwelt on in most histories I've seen so far, it's one thing I always like to nitpick on, is that honestly, we really messed up in the pre-war years on what it takes to conduct tactical reconnaissance. The entire battle for the American side hinges on the ability to spot the enemy, identify him correctly, and to have him located with some precision. We weren't able to do that because we were relying on a vulnerable, slow reconnaissance platform, the PBY Catalina, that was exceptionally vulnerable to fighter interception. And we had basically passed over an opportunity because of the bureaucratic squabble between Army aviation and the Navy about not having a reconnaissance platform that could take care of itself. I put it to you, Chris. What do you think would have happened if we had a squadron of naval B-17s with qualified naval observers conducting tactical reconnaissance at altitude, and if the Zeros came up to play,
Right.
a high altitude fortress probably had a decent chance.
You would think, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's what I'd like. That's a what if I'd like to throw out there, is that if we didn't have lumbering PBYs, but say PB, PB1s going by naval designation at that time, naval Boeing B-17s conducting reconnaissance, we could have had a lot of really accurate information, because the only reason Hornet missed the bombing part of the attack, and sheer luck that Enterprise even found the Japanese, is that we had faulty, non-real-time reconnaissance information being sent to the carriers, who have to launch hour and a half, 2 hours ahead of where the target's supposed to be. That's tough. And
Right.
so that's one of those might have beens, is that if we hadn't had such spotty reconnaissance reports going into our carriers, we might have been able to get 3 air groups onto the target intact at the same time, which would have been a battle of annihilation at that point. As it turns out, it was sheer luck that we were able to knock out 3/4 of the force unintentionally with uncoordinated coordination with dive bombers.
There is a great book on the development of the SBD and the tactics associated with that, called Destined for Glory. I think it would be nice for the author if I could remember his name. Maybe we can edit that
Wilkenberg.
in. Thank you.
Yeah, good guy.
But yeah, he gets after exactly what you're talking about, right? And how important the tactical reconnaissance doctrine was to the outcome of the battle. But as you say, we've got all these Japanese forces arrayed all over the place. But really, the only ones that get to play in the action are the 4 ships of the Kido Butai. So they close on Midway, and then maybe you ought to take a minute or two and just very basically walk through the next set of actions that happen as they attack the island.
Well, I guess a subtitle for the Battle of Midway, if we want to do it 19th century style with book titles, is the Battle of Midway, or Why Reconnaissance Doctrine Really Matters. Because we had our own problems, as I just elaborated on, and Nagumo, the admiral in charge of the Kido Butai, had a real problem with his own reconnaissance. The issue is that there's no strategic reconnaissance. All their attempts to figure out what the U.S. fleet are up to before the battle come to naught. The submarines are poorly deployed and show up a day or two late. And they have zero aerial reconnaissance beforehand because of the remoteness of the battle. So basically, that means Kido Butai has to come in and rely on its own reconnaissance assets. And rather than unduly deprive the tactical striking power of their own flight decks, as Halsey had to do at Leyte Gulf with the Sibuyan Sea action, but that's a whole other anniversary talk. He basically, Nagumo had to rely on cruiser float planes, which are quite slow, quite vulnerable, and they could only go out at a certain point prior to dawn without using up all their fuel during daylight hours to conduct a visual search. No radar involved here at all. And frankly, he was darned lucky that he had a dedicated crew from the Tone who were able to find the Yorktown group and to stick it out and to give him the only useful tactical information he had during the entire battle. And so it's just amazing how flimsy the reconnaissance presence was for Nagumo, because he's coming in completely cold. He has no idea where the U.S. fleet is. They have no intel on Midway's air strength and defenses. And he's supposed to conduct preliminary raids for both a sea battle and a major amphibious assault, all in one package. And so, unfortunately for him, he has zero information on what he's truly facing. He has a rather flimsy and slow-moving reconnaissance line with the float planes ahead of time. So he's just going by schedule. He's launching an attack against a shore station with no expectation he's got any naval opposition anywhere nearby, just as they had done at Wake Island and Rabaul and Darwin and so on. So here we go. And imagine his surprise when he's getting word back from his strike group that Midway's a tough target. We're going to need a bigger boat. We need another strike. And in the middle of all this, he gets word, we've just detected a naval task force. And then intermittently, he finds out from this same group from the Tonay, this same crew, oh, they have a carrier. Why is there a carrier out here off Midway of all places? So essentially, his clockwork attack plan completely falls apart because of this sudden shock that he's got actionable intelligence, and it's not good right in the middle of his action plan. So that's just something that really needs to be drawn out in these latter days, is that Midway is basically a story of intelligence and reconnaissance and what you do with it.
For sure. And so as he's frantically trying to figure out what to do with these bits and pieces of information that he's got, this is the moment that the Enterprise dive bombers with Wade McCluskey sort of have this stroke of luck that you were talking about. So maybe pick it up from.
Actually, there's something, several things that happen, most of them tragic, that actually leads up to that dramatic point. And that, again, it goes back to technology. First off, Midway was able to scramble its polyglot collection of aircraft from all kinds of services and different performance characteristics, but they couldn't coordinate. So the only thing they were able to accomplish with these early raids is they kept the Japanese carriers bobbing and weaving and moving and darting about, avoiding any damage while their crews are trying to rearm for an anti-shipping strike, and they're trying to dodge B-17 raids from altitude, some of which, as we've seen from the surviving photographs, got dangerously close with their bomb strikes and dive bombing and torpedo strikes. But the real vital bit, but it's a tragic one from the U.S. perspective, is the sacrifice of Torpedo 8, which proceeded independently by its own squadron commander's determination. Rather than following CAG on the Hornet heading due west, he heads more in a southerly direction and does manage to find the Japanese after all. Just after his squadron is wiped out, that's when Torpedo 6 shows up, because they noticed the smoke screens the Japanese were using to help confuse Torpedo 8. So they now have a serial torpedo attack from two U.S. carrier squadrons that, again, sends the Kido Butai bobbing and weaving, and they wind up having an elongated formation. They have pathetic anti-aircraft screening and defense. 99% of the defense of the Kido Butai is their zero combat air patrol, which, by the way, has no air discipline. They demonstrated this with the Ceylon attack, where a squadron of Blenheims surprised the Kido Butai from altitude, with bombs splashes suddenly appearing near the Akagi. And get this, the entire cap chases the Blenheim squadron for over 20 miles to shoot down empty bombers, leaving Kido Butai completely unprotected in the meantime. Guess what they do at Midway? They get really excited in fighting the two torpedo squadrons, so most of the cap comes down to sea level to go engage with those torpedo planes. And just as they're trying to put things back together after the survivors of Torpedo 6 disengage, they're trying to get aircraft coming back in for refueling, finishing the rearming, get the squadron back to some semblance of organization. That's when Torpedo 3 shows up from the Yorktown, and it's here we go again. So they're concentrating on Torpedo 3, but what they don't notice is that the two squadrons from the Enterprise are coming over the southern horizon, and the Yorktown dive bombers are coming over the northern horizon. And it just turns into a complete catastrophe for the Japanese because of severe problems they let fester with their fleet air defense doctrine.
All right, so at the end of all of this, and then moving into the next day, of course, we end up with the entire Kido Butai, or what of it was present there, being sunk at the loss of one American aircraft carrier, the Yorktown. Um, because of this colossal American victory, I think it's safe to say that as the years have gone past since Midway, that the battle itself has almost evolved into a little bit of its own mythology, where you have this story of these few brave Americans against overwhelming odds that had no right at all to expect to win, and yet somehow the Americans carry the day and we destroy the enemy. And Midway has really taken on a life of its own, and people make comparisons to Trafalgar, that Midway is sort of the Trafalgar for the U.S. Navy, but the reality, and historians in the last couple of decades have spent a little bit more time trying to kind of debunk the story that we tell ourselves, and say, the battle was actually the forces were fairly closely aligned, and really it comes down to training and doctrine and tactics. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Certainly, and I have to confess that for decades I've never bought into the incredible victory or miracle at Midway as two prominent book titles would have you believe, because honestly, it came down to who made the fewer mistakes,
Mm-hmm.
and who was able to accidentally exploit weaknesses with the other. And it just so happens that it fell more in favor of the Americans on June 4th than it did the Japanese. I'm not denigrating any valor or anything, but it basically came down to superb use of strategic intelligence when it arrived in a timely manner. Nimitz deserves all credit as the architect of victory at Midway by putting the right forces in at just the right time to give us a chance for a victory at Midway. And the rest of it came down to a high degree of luck. One thing I like to point out with talks I give occasionally on the Battle of Midway is that it's one of the few battles of significance in the mechanized era of warfare where the actions of junior leaders at the point of contact in the heat of battle could cause the action to turn one way or the other. You have you have stuff like that in ancient battles. You have things like that happen in the early gunpowder era here and there. But in the mechanized era of warfare, Midway is a case study on the determination and leadership styles of junior commanders. Wade McCluskey and his determination to extend his search and having it pay off with accidentally discovering the Japanese destroyer Arashi speeding off. He could have just gotten right to the end of his search radius and decided, well, looks like we missed him today, guys. Let's go back to the barn. Did not do that. Now, he almost undid his luck by not being a dive bomber pilot and almost having over concentration on the Kaga. So this is where you get more examples of junior leadership. Dick Best, a lieutenant, is a professional dive bomber pilot, and he was expecting Scouting 8 to go after one carrier and Scouting 6 and Bombing 6 to go after separate carriers. Instead, Wade McCluskey told everybody, follow me, and diving in on just the Kaga. So Best was ready to bomb Kaga according to Doctrine when he saw everybody else flying past him. So he broke off his dive, signaled his two wingmen, we're going to go after this guy. And they improvised a 3-man attack on the flagship. And one near miss shook everybody up on the carrier. A second very near miss may have damaged her steering, but Dick was able to put his bomb right square in the middle of of the hangar deck, and that was the end of Akagi right there. So split-second leadership who leads to a decisive strike, destroying a second enemy asset, while the CAG accidentally leads everybody else in clobbering the Kaga. So that's an example then of junior leadership really making a difference at Midway. A third example is Jimmy Thatch, leader of Fighting 3 off the Yorktown. He was one of the few who recognized the potential of this new fighter plane that was being described over East Asia before Pearl Harbor, and realizing what can I do to make the Wildcat work against such a fighter, and he's the one who developed what he called the beam defense method, or better known as the thatch weave, which he employs for the first time at Midway, trying to protect Torpedo 3. His success in continually knocking down one zero after the other added to the frenzy of driving the zero cap towards his area of action, leaving the skies open for the dive bombers to come in from on high. So that's something that needs to be emphasized, I think, a little more, was that you had intelligent commanders who could think on their feet, make the correct decision in the heat of combat, and get immediate drastic results that turned Midway into such a stunning reversal for Japanese fortunes. The other thing of it really comes down to is figuring out where you have a weakness in your doctrine beforehand and making sure the enemy can't exploit it, such as better reconnaissance information, better combat air patrol work. The Americans had a lot to learn with what radar could and could not do. We also, of course, figured out the hard way with the Yorktown that you need to change your watch, quarter, and station bill and have a salvage crew. Yorktown could have been saved. They wasted an entire day with the ship being mostly abandoned, and then had to waste the better part of a second day sorting out a salvage crew amongst the survivors scattered amongst all the rescue vessels. So it's a case of you really have to think ahead, anticipate problems, and have doctrine that could close off as many loopholes as possible. So Midway's a wonderful case study in being able to see how you have doctrinal weaknesses and how an enemy, intentionally or otherwise, could exploit them for victory.
Absolutely. So as we move past the kind of the end of the battle, what are some of the short-term and then maybe longer-term strategic implications for the outcome of the Battle of Midway?
I think the thing that historians, particularly World War II, not just Pacific War historians, need to emphasize more for the public is that June 1942 was a critical month in the conduct of the entire global Second World War. So what we have going on is that Operation Blue, the German drive into the Caucasus, was well underway. The Red Army is being pushed back yet again in a critical part of the Eastern Front. This leads, of course, to the debacle at Stalingrad later that year. But June of 42, that's getting pretty dicey for the Allied side on the Eastern Front. The British are at their absolute nadir in the North African campaign. Tobruk is just fallen, and Auchinleck has pulled his forces deep back across the border, well into Egypt, with Rommel snapping at his heels the entire time. And of course, the Japanese are about to pounce on New Guinea again. The army is going to embark on its own campaign to seize Port Moresby. So taking a look at where suddenly a Axis partner is stymied in a single battle at Midway, this gives Allied leaders in London and Washington, and a little bit in the Kremlin as well, a chance to do something to really turn things around. This is where force allocations start to shift around. We're not pressed desperately as we were leading into the Battle of Midway. So in the context of World War II, Midway basically was like a switch being thrown, and suddenly opportunities had just presented themselves that weren't there before the battle. This, of course, is most obvious with King being able to shift over to more of an offensive mentality in the Pacific rather than a strategic defensive one. And it also gives the Americans a chance to be able to shift forces to help the British rebuild their desert army at this low point in the North African campaign, as well as helping out the Russians. So Midway basically stops the Japanese momentarily and gives aggressive thinking leaders in the Allied camp a chance to start making different kinds of preparations that pay off at the end of the year with the start of a string of Axis disasters around the globe.
Well, on that note, I think our time for our session is just about up. So again, Kurt Zingheim from the USS Midway Museum in San Diego, California, thanks very much for spending some time with the National Museum of the U.S. Navy, and we appreciate you coming on the program.
Thank you for having me, Chris.